Hey there, friend. Welcome to another journey into history's darker corners. Tonight we're stepping into something that might feel a bit heavy at first, but I promise we'll ease into it gently. Whether you're settling in for the night or just looking to slow down from the day, I'm grateful you're here with me. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if you find this helpful, and subscribe if these quiet explorations into the past bring you some peace. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all drifting through history together, wherever we are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on that fan for some gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Picture this. It's September 11th, 2001. You wake up to what seems like an ordinary Tuesday morning. The coffee's brewing, the news is on. Maybe you're getting ready for work or school. But within hours, this seemingly normal day would become one of the most documented, analysed, and remembered days in modern history. But here's the thing we often forget when we look back at 9/11 through the lens of hindsight, through documentaries and memorial services, and carefully preserved footage. If you had been there, in those moments, without knowing what we know now, your chances of understanding what was happening, let alone surviving it, would have been far more complicated than we might imagine. See, we remember 9/11 as a day of heroes, of first responders rushing toward danger, of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, and all of that is true. But we also remember it with the clarity of aftermath, with the knowledge of exactly what happened and why. We know the timeline, the perpetrators, the methods. We know how it ended. But imagine you're there, in those moments, with none of that knowledge. Imagine you're in the World Trade Center, going about your morning routine, when suddenly everything changes. Not gradually, not with warning, but instantly, incomprehensibly, violently. The first thing you need to understand about why you might not have survived 9/11 isn't about the buildings or the planes or even the fires. It's about information, or rather, the complete absence of it. In 2001, most people didn't carry smartphones. There was no Twitter, no instant news alerts, no way to immediately understand what was happening beyond what you could see with your own eyes. If you were in the North Tower when the first plane hit at 8:46 a.m., you might have felt the building shake, heard an enormous crash, maybe seen debris falling past your window. But you wouldn't have known it was a plane. You certainly wouldn't have known it was intentional. The building's announcement system told people in the South Tower to remain at their desks. This wasn't malicious. It wasn't incompetent. It was reasonable advice based on the information available at the time. No one had ever seen anything like this before. The protocols, the procedures, the emergency responses, they were all designed for fires, for accidents, for the kinds of disasters people could imagine. But this wasn't something anyone had imagined. So you might have stayed at your desk, following official guidance, trusting that the authorities knew what they were doing. And in the South Tower, that decision would have cost you everything when the second plane hit at 9:03 a.m. Or maybe you were one of the people who decided to evacuate anyway, who felt something was wrong and started making your way down the stairwells. That sounds like the smart choice, doesn't it? The survivable choice. But even then, you were navigating a situation no emergency drill had ever prepared you for. The stairwells in the World Trade Center were designed for normal evacuations, not for 50,000 people trying to leave simultaneously. Not for elevators that had stopped working. Not for smoke and debris and the kind of structural damage that made every step uncertain. If you worked on the upper floors, above where the planes hit, you faced an almost impossible situation. The impact zones had destroyed the stairwells. The elevators were gone. For many people trapped above the 78th floor in the South Tower and the 92nd floor in the North Tower, there simply was no way down. Some tried to go up, to the roof, hoping for helicopter rescue. It seemed logical. In movies, in other disasters, helicopters evacuated people from rooftops. But the roof access was locked, and even if it hadn't been, the smoke and heat made helicopter rescue impossible. Others waited by windows, hoping for rescue that would never come. Some made the unfathomable choice to jump rather than face the fire and smoke. These weren't decisions made in panic or confusion. These were conscious choices made by people who could see clearly that they were facing an impossible situation. Let's say you were one of the fortunate ones who made it to the stairwells early, who started evacuating before the second plane hit. You still face challenges that would test every assumption you had about how buildings work, how emergencies unfold, how much time you have when disaster strikes. The descent took hours, not minutes, hours. People who started evacuating immediately after the first plane hit were still in the stairwells when the towers collapsed. The stairwells were narrow, crowded, filled with smoke. Emergency lighting failed in sections. People were injured, exhausted, carrying each other. And through it all, you had no idea how much time you had. You didn't know that both towers would collapse. No one did. The idea that these massive modern skyscrapers could completely pancake to the ground wasn't something engineers, emergency responders, or ordinary people had seriously considered. So you might have stopped to help someone who was injured. You might have gone back for a colleague. You might have taken a break on a landing to catch your breath. All reasonable, human, decent choices that could have meant the difference between making it out and not. Even the first responders, the heroes we rightly celebrate, were operating without crucial information. Firefighters climbed the stairs in the South Tower even after the North Tower had collapsed, because their radios weren't working properly. They couldn't hear the evacuation orders. They were climbing towards certain death, not because they were reckless, but because they didn't know what we know now. The truth is, survival on 9/11 often came down to factors completely beyond anyone's control. Which floor you worked on, whether you decided to get coffee before going to your office, whether you took an earlier or later train, whether you happened to be in a meeting on a different floor, whether you were running late that morning. Some people survived because they were smokers and went outside for a cigarette. Others survived because they were stuck in traffic. Some died because they were punctual, because they followed directions, because they tried to help others. This wasn't a disaster where preparation, knowledge, or even quick thinking guaranteed survival. This was a disaster that revealed how much of what we consider normal life depends on systems, assumptions, and information networks that can disappear in an instant. And that's just the beginning of why you might not have survived 9/11. We haven't even talked about the psychological impact of witnessing something so far outside the realm of normal experience that your brain couldn't process it. We haven't discussed the physical challenges of escaping from buildings that were never designed for this kind of catastrophic failure. We haven't explored how the very qualities that make us human, our instinct to help others, our tendency to follow authority, our assumption that buildings are safe, could become liabilities in a situation no one had ever faced before. The story of 9/11 isn't just about terrorism or politics or national security. It's about the fragility of the systems we depend on, the assumptions we make about safety and normalcy, and how quickly the unthinkable can become reality. So, settle in, because we're going to explore not just what happened that day, but why the very way we think about disasters, emergencies, and survival might not prepare us for the unimaginable. We're going to understand why even the most prepared, most alert, most rational person might not have made it out alive. And maybe, in understanding that, we can better appreciate not just the heroism of those who did survive and those who died trying to save others, but the simple, terrible fact that sometimes survival isn't about being smart or brave or prepared. Sometimes it's just about being lucky. But if you thought the physical dangers we've just explored were the worst of medieval romantic life, you're about to discover something even more insidious. Because beyond the disease and death, beyond the filth and violence, lay a psychological landscape so twisted and oppressive that it turned the very act of falling in love into a form of mental torture. Picture this. You're a young woman in 13th century France, perhaps 15 years old, and you've begun to feel something stirring in your heart for the baker's son. In our modern world, this might be the beginning of a sweet courtship, maybe some nervous conversations and stolen glances. But in medieval times, that flutter in your chest was not just dangerous to your reputation or your family's plans. It was dangerous to your eternal soul. The Catholic Church, which controlled every aspect of medieval life with an iron fist wrapped in Holy Scripture, had very specific and terrifying opinions about romantic love. According to church doctrine, passionate feelings between unmarried people were not merely inappropriate, they were evidence of demonic possession. The church taught that Satan used romantic desire as his primary weapon against Christian souls, and that young people who displayed signs of infatuation were quite literally under the influence of evil spirits. This wasn't metaphorical. Medieval people genuinely believed that falling in love could damn you to hell for eternity. The physical sensations we now recognize as perfectly normal romantic attraction, the racing heart, the sleepless nights, the obsessive thoughts about your beloved, were interpreted as symptoms of spiritual corruption. Young women who admitted to romantic feelings were often subjected to exorcism rituals that could last for days, involving fasting, prayer, and sometimes physical abuse, designed to drive out the demons that had supposedly taken hold of their hearts. But the Church's psychological warfare against romantic love went even deeper than fear of damnation. Medieval Christianity had developed an elaborate theology around the concept of spiritual marriage, teaching that the highest form of love was the soul's union with Christ. Any earthly romantic attachment was seen as a betrayal of this sacred relationship, a turning away from God toward the base, animal desires of the flesh. This created an impossible psychological bind for young people. They were human beings with natural desires for connection and intimacy, but they were taught that these very desires were evidence of their spiritual failure. Imagine trying to fall asleep at night while believing that the warm feelings in your chest when you thought about someone were actually the whispers of demons trying to steal your soul. The psychological damage was immense and lasting. The Church's control over medieval minds extended into every aspect of courtship and marriage. Priests didn't just perform wedding ceremonies. They dictated who could marry whom, when marriages could take place, and even how married couples should behave in their most intimate moments. The church calendar was so filled with holy days, fast days, and periods of required abstinence that married couples were forbidden from physical intimacy for roughly 2/3 of the year. Even when intimacy was permitted, it came with a crushing burden of guilt and shame. Church doctrine taught that sexual pleasure, even within marriage, was inherently sinful. Couples were instructed to approach their marital duties with reluctance and to take no enjoyment from the physical act of procreation. Manuals written by church authorities provided detailed instructions on how to minimize pleasure during intercourse, suggesting specific positions and mental exercises designed to keep couples focused on their reproductive duty rather than their emotional connection. For women, this psychological oppression was particularly devastating. Medieval Christianity viewed women as inherently more susceptible to sexual temptation and demonic influence. Eve's role in the fall of man was cited as proof that women could not be trusted with their own desires. A woman who showed enthusiasm for her husband, who seemed to enjoy physical intimacy, or who expressed romantic feelings too openly, was suspected of being under supernatural influence, or of possessing an unnatural and dangerous sexuality. The psychological pressure was so intense that many women learned to suppress not just their desires, but their personalities entirely. Surviving letters and diary entries from medieval women reveal a heartbreaking pattern of self-doubt and self-loathing. They write of feeling guilty for loving their husbands too much, of worrying that their natural affections were evidence of moral corruption, of desperately trying to feel less in order to be considered good Christians. But perhaps most cruelly, the Church's psychological control system was designed to be self-perpetuating. The more miserable people became in their relationships, the more they turned to religion for comfort. The more they suppressed their natural desires, the more those desires seemed unnatural and frightening when they inevitably surfaced. The Church had created a perfect trap: make people ashamed of their humanity, then offer salvation from that shame through even greater submission to Church authority. This psychological oppression was reinforced by a social structure that made independent thought virtually impossible. In medieval society, questioning Church doctrine wasn't just heretical, it was social suicide. Communities were small and tightly knit, with everyone watching everyone else for signs of moral deviation. A young person who expressed doubts about Church teachings on love and marriage would quickly find themselves ostracized, making their already difficult life impossible. The feudal system added another layer of psychological pressure to romantic relationships. Remember, most people in medieval times were serfs, essentially owned by their feudal lords. The lord had the legal right to approve or deny marriages among his subjects, and these decisions were made based on economic and political considerations, never on the feelings of the people involved. This meant that young people lived with the constant knowledge that their romantic futures were completely out of their control. You might fall in love with someone who lived on a different lord's estate, making marriage impossible. You might be ordered to marry someone you found repulsive, with no legal recourse. The psychological impact of this powerlessness was devastating, creating a sense of learned helplessness that pervaded every aspect of medieval life. The economic realities of medieval existence added yet another layer of psychological stress to romantic relationships. For the vast majority of people, survival was a daily struggle that left little room for the emotional luxury of romance. When you're constantly worried about having enough food to make it through the winter, when disease could strike at any moment, when violence was an ever-present threat, the idea of choosing a partner based on love rather than practical necessity seemed not just frivolous, but dangerous. This created a psychological split that many medieval people never resolved. They were human beings with the same capacity for love and connection that we have today, but they lived in a world that treated those feelings as not just irrelevant, but actively harmful. The internal conflict between natural human desires and social expectations created a kind of chronic psychological stress that manifested in various ways throughout medieval society. Some people responded by becoming religious extremists, channeling their suppressed romantic feelings into obsessive devotion to God. The medieval period saw the rise of numerous mystical movements and religious orders that promised escape from earthly desires through spiritual transcendence. Others turned to violence, and the medieval period's reputation for brutality can be partly understood as the result of a society that systematically frustrated its members' most basic human needs. But perhaps most tragically, many people simply learned to live without hope for genuine connection. They went through the motions of courtship and marriage as social and economic necessities, but they never expected to find real love or happiness in their relationships. The psychological numbness that this created is evident in medieval literature and art, which often portrays human relationships in terms of duty, suffering, and resignation rather than joy or fulfillment. The concept of courtly love, which we'll explore further later, can be understood partly as a psychological defense mechanism against this oppressive reality. By creating elaborate fantasies about impossible romantic relationships, medieval people could experience vicarious emotional satisfaction without challenging the social and religious structures that made real romantic fulfillment impossible. As we continue our exploration of why dating was a nightmare in medieval times, We'll see how these psychological pressures, combined with social, economic, and physical dangers, to create a perfect storm of romantic misery. The medieval approach to love and relationships was so fundamentally toxic that it would take centuries for Western civilization to begin recovering from its effects. So the next time you feel frustrated with modern dating apps or complicated relationship dynamics, remember the young woman lying awake at night in medieval France, terrified that her feelings for the baker's son were evidence that demons had taken hold of her soul. Remember that in the grand sweep of human history, the freedom to love whom we choose, when we choose, and how we choose is not just precious but revolutionary. The psychological warfare that medieval society waged against the human heart was perhaps its cruelest legacy, one that reminds us that the most dangerous prisons are often the ones we build in our own minds. In medieval times, even thinking about love could be a form of torture, and the scars left by that systematic psychological oppression would echo through generations. But while the confusion and chaos we've explored so far painted a grim picture of survival prospects, the true nightmare of September 11th was only beginning to unfold. Because as the morning progressed and people found themselves trapped in increasingly desperate situations, they discovered that even the most basic assumptions about emergency response and building safety were catastrophically wrong. You see, the World Trade Center wasn't just any office building. It was a monument to human engineering, a testament to our ability to reach toward the sky. The towers were designed to withstand hurricane-force winds, even the impact of a Boeing 707, which was the largest aircraft in common use when they were built in the 1960s. What the engineers couldn't have anticipated was the specific horror of September 11th. Fully fueled commercial airliners, much larger than anything they'd planned for, creating fires that would burn at temperatures hot enough to weaken the very bones of these steel giants. For the people trapped above the impact zones, this engineering reality became a death sentence, written in physics and metallurgy. The jet fuel from the planes didn't just create fires, it created infernos that spread along the floors, consuming everything in their path. The temperatures reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. Steel doesn't need to melt to fail completely. It just needs to get hot enough to lose its strength. And at those temperatures, the massive steel beams that held up each floor began to buckle and sag like overcooked pasta. But here's what makes this even more terrifying. Most people trapped in the towers had no way of knowing this was happening. The buildings felt solid beneath their feet right up until the moment they weren't. There was no gradual warning, no creaking and groaning that movies would have you expect. The structural failure, when it came, was swift and total. Consider Sarah, a financial analyst working on the 97th floor of the South Tower. She survived the initial impact to the North Tower and watched from her window as papers fluttered through the air like snow. Her building hadn't been hit yet. The elevators in her tower were still working. The stairwells were clear. Every instinct, every piece of conventional wisdom about building emergencies told her she was safe. Then, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 slammed into her building between the 77th and 85th floors. Sarah was now trapped above the impact zone with roughly 600 other people. The jet fuel explosion had severed all three stairwells in the South Tower. Unlike the North Tower, where stairwell A remained partially passable, there was literally no way down. The people above the impact zones faced a choice that no human being should ever have to make. They could stay in the towers as the fires spread and the smoke thickened, hoping against hope for a rescue that was physically impossible, or they could make the unthinkable decision to jump. The images of people falling from the towers remain some of the most haunting from that day, but what's often lost is that these weren't acts of despair. They were rational decisions made by people who understood, perhaps better than anyone else, exactly what was happening to the buildings. The smoke alone was killing people. Modern office buildings are filled with synthetic materials that, when they burn, produce toxic gases. The black smoke pouring from the towers wasn't just hot, it was poisonous. People were suffocating on cyanide and carbon monoxide. The choice to jump wasn't about giving up hope, it was about choosing how to die. And here's something that still haunts the families of victims today. Many of the people who died in the towers that morning were on the phone with loved ones right up until the end. They were getting advice from family members, from 911 dispatchers, from fire department officials, all telling them to stay put, to wait for rescue, to remain calm. This wasn't bad advice given what anyone knew at the time. It was the standard protocol for high-rise emergencies. But September 11th wasn't a standard emergency. The 911 system, which we all rely on as our lifeline in emergencies, was completely overwhelmed. Dispatchers were receiving thousands of calls from people trapped in the towers, but they had no way of knowing that the buildings were on the verge of total collapse. The fire department's communication systems weren't integrated with the police department's systems, so crucial information wasn't being shared. Firefighters climbing the stairs had no way of knowing that the chiefs who could see the building's condition from the outside were ordering an evacuation. This communication breakdown meant that people were receiving conflicting information at the worst possible time. Some were told to evacuate immediately. Others were told to stay in place. Some were told that rescue was coming. Others heard nothing at all. In the confusion, many people made decisions based on outdated information or no information at all. But even for those who got clear, accurate information and made all the right decisions, survival often came down to pure chance. The timing of when you started evacuating could mean the difference between life and death, measured in seconds. People who left their offices immediately after the first plane hit had a fighting chance. Those who stayed to shut down computers, gather personal belongings, or make phone calls often didn't. Consider two friends working on the same floor of the North Tower. Michael decided to leave immediately after the first impact, even though his building hadn't been hit. He gathered nothing, took the stairs, and was out of the building within 15 minutes. David stayed behind for just 5 more minutes to call his wife and tell her he was okay. Those 5 minutes put him in the stairwell when the second plane hit, creating a panic that slowed evacuation to a crawl. Michael survived. David didn't make it out before the towers fell. The cruelest aspect of the September 11th attacks was how they turned our normal safety instincts against us. Everything we're taught about building emergencies, about staying calm, about waiting for official instructions, about helping others, worked against survival that day. The people who survived were often those who broke the rules, who ignored authority, who trusted their gut instincts over official guidance. This wasn't because the authorities were incompetent or malicious. It was because no one, absolutely no one, had imagined a scenario like this. The emergency response protocols were designed for fires, for bomb threats, for medical emergencies. They weren't designed for the deliberate destruction of the buildings themselves by massive commercial aircraft used as weapons. As we'll see in the coming parts of our story, this breakdown of normal safety assumptions extended far beyond the towers themselves. The entire city's emergency response system was overwhelmed. Hospitals found themselves treating injuries they'd never seen before. The subway system shut down, stranding hundreds of thousands of people. The air traffic control system went into lockdown, grounding every aircraft in American airspace. But perhaps most tragically, the very qualities that make us human, our tendency to help others, to follow social norms, to trust authority, to believe that rescue is coming, worked against survival on September 11th. The day demanded a kind of selfishness and paranoia that most people simply aren't capable of, even when their lives depend on it. This is why September 11th remains so deeply traumatic for our collective psyche. It wasn't just an attack on buildings, or even on people. It was an attack on our fundamental assumptions about how the world works, about how buildings behave, about how authorities respond, about how much time we have when disaster strikes. It showed us that in the space of 102 minutes, everything we thought we knew about safety and survival could become not just wrong, but deadly. So when we ask whether you would have survived September 11th, we're not just asking whether you would have made the right split-second decisions under pressure. We're asking whether you could have abandoned a lifetime of conditioning about how to behave in emergencies. We're asking whether you could have ignored official guidance from trusted authorities. We're asking whether you could have left injured colleagues behind to save yourself. These aren't comfortable questions, and they don't have comfortable answers. Because the truth is that survival on September 11th often required people to act in ways that go against every instinct we have about how to be a good person in a crisis. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is why the attack succeeded so completely in terrorizing not just the people in those buildings, but all of us who watched in horror as our assumptions about safety and survival crumbled along with the towers themselves. The radio crackled with static as Fire Chief Palmer's voice cut through the chaos on the 78th floor of the South Tower. "We've got 2 isolated pockets of fire," he reported, his tone remarkably calm given the circumstances. "We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines." It was 9:52 a.m., just 20 minutes before the South Tower would collapse completely. Palmer and his team had no idea they were about to die, because the emergency response protocols they'd trained for their entire careers had never contemplated anything like this. See, here's what makes 9/11 so uniquely terrifying from a survival perspective. It wasn't just that people were trapped in burning buildings. It wasn't just that escape routes were blocked or that help was delayed. The real nightmare was that every system designed to save lives, every protocol written in blood from previous disasters, every piece of emergency wisdom accumulated over decades, all of it was not just inadequate but actively counterproductive. The emergency response playbook was written for fires that started small and grew larger, not for massive aviation fuel explosions that instantly compromised entire floors. It was designed for structural damage that happened gradually, giving people time to evacuate, not for the sudden obliteration of stairwells and elevators across multiple floors simultaneously. Most critically, it assumed that emergency responders would have reliable communication, accurate information about conditions inside the buildings, and enough time to coordinate a proper response. They had none of these things. The radios didn't work properly in the towers. The repeater system that was supposed to boost signals had been damaged. Different agencies, the FDNY, NYPD, Port Authority Police, couldn't talk to each other even under normal circumstances, and these were anything but normal circumstances. So, while Chief Palmer was calmly reporting manageable fires on the 78th floor, other responders in different parts of the building were seeing catastrophic structural damage and complete system failures. Nobody had the full picture. The evacuation procedures that had been drilled countless times assumed that stairwells would remain passable, that people could move in an orderly fashion, that the buildings would remain stable long enough for everyone to get out. The South Tower had approximately 13,000 people inside when the second plane hit. Under normal circumstances, even a full evacuation might take over an hour. But normal circumstances don't include jet fuel fires burning at temperatures hot enough to weaken steel, or the complete destruction of multiple floors creating a debris field that made passage impossible. What's even more chilling is how the very training that emergency responders had received worked against them. Firefighters are taught to never abandon a burning building, while civilians might still be trapped inside. It's drilled into them from day one. It's the core of their professional identity. So when evacuation orders finally came, many simply couldn't bring themselves to leave. They had no framework for understanding that the building itself was about to become a weapon against them. The same deadly loyalty applied to civilians. People had been conditioned by decades of fire drills to wait for instructions, to move slowly and deliberately, to trust that the authorities knew what they were doing. In the North Tower, many people who could have escaped stayed at their desks because they were told the building was secure. The public address system kept repeating that the tower was safe, that people should remain in their offices, even as smoke poured through the building and the structure itself began to fail. This wasn't incompetence. It was worse than incompetence. It was the complete breakdown of everything we thought we knew about emergency response. The incident command system that was supposed to coordinate rescue efforts assumed that commanders would have accurate, real-time information about conditions throughout the emergency zone. Instead, they were operating blind, making decisions based on protocols designed for entirely different scenarios. Consider the elevator situation. In a normal high-rise fire, elevators are shut down and people use the stairwells. But when the planes hit, they didn't just start fires. They created massive debris fields that blocked stairwells and trapped elevators between floors. Some people spent their final hour trapped in elevator cars, following the exact safety procedures they'd been taught while the buildings burned around them. The 911 system, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of calls, couldn't provide accurate guidance to people trapped in the towers. Operators, working from scripts designed for house fires and medical emergencies, found themselves trying to advise people in situations that had never been contemplated. Some told people to stay put and wait for help that would never come. Others suggested escape routes that no longer existed. Emergency medical services faced their own impossible contradictions. They were trained to establish treatment areas close enough to the scene to provide rapid care, but far enough away to be safe from the immediate danger. But how do you calculate a safe distance from a 110-story building that might collapse without warning? The normal protocols called for staging areas a few blocks away. When the towers came down, the debris field extended far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The psychological impact on survivors was compounded by this systematic failure of everything they'd been taught to trust. People who followed official instructions often found themselves in greater danger than those who ignored authority and fled immediately. The social contract that says, "Listen to the experts and you'll be okay," was shattered along with everything else that morning. What makes this even more tragic is that many of the emergency responders understood, on some level, that their usual methods weren't working, but they had no alternative framework to fall back on. When your entire professional identity is built around running toward danger to save people, what do you do when the danger is so great that running toward it is guaranteed suicide? The building engineers and safety experts who had designed the tower's emergency systems had considered many scenarios. They'd planned for small aircraft impacts, for fires on multiple floors, for power failures and communication breakdowns. But they hadn't imagined the complete systemic failure that occurred when fully fueled commercial airliners were used as guided missiles. Their safety systems weren't just overwhelmed, they became part of the problem. The intercom systems that were supposed to provide clear evacuation instructions became sources of deadly misinformation. The fireproof stairwells that were designed to be safe refuges became death traps when the aircraft impacts compromised their structural integrity. The emergency lighting that was meant to guide people to safety led them into areas where escape was impossible. Perhaps most horrifying of all, the very qualities that make someone good at emergency response, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to follow established procedures, to trust in training and equipment. These became liabilities when faced with a completely unprecedented situation. The people who were most prepared, most professional, most dedicated to saving lives were often the ones who died because they couldn't abandon everything they'd been taught about how emergencies work. This is why 9/11 represents such a unique kind of survival horror. It wasn't just that bad things happened to good people. It's that all the systems we'd built to protect people, all the wisdom we'd accumulated about emergency response, all the training and preparation and professional expertise, It all became irrelevant or worse in the face of something we'd never imagined. The morning of September 11th exposed the terrifying fragility of our assumptions about safety and survival. It showed that even the most comprehensive emergency planning can be rendered useless by attackers willing to use methods that fall outside our ability to imagine or prepare for. And it demonstrated that in truly unprecedented situations, the difference between life and death often comes down not to following procedures or trusting experts, but to making split-second decisions based on incomplete information while everything you thought you knew about survival crumbles around you. The communication breakdown that defined September 11th wasn't just about failed technology or poor planning. It was about the fundamental incompatibility between a system designed for predictable emergencies and an attack that shattered every assumption about how disasters unfold. In the minutes and hours following the initial impacts, the very infrastructure meant to coordinate rescue efforts became a labyrinth of confusion that trapped responders and civilians alike in a maze of contradictory information. Consider the plight of Battalion Chief Joseph Pfeiffer, one of the first fire commanders to arrive at the World Trade Center. His radio crackled with fragments of information, half sentences cut off by static, voices overlapping in a cacophony of urgent but incomprehensible updates. Fire companies were reporting in from different frequencies, police helicopters were broadcasting on separate channels, and the Port Authority had its own communication system entirely. It was like trying to conduct an orchestra where each musician was playing from a different sheet of music, in a different key, and couldn't hear the conductor. The radios themselves became instruments of isolation rather than coordination. The ultra-high-frequency systems used by the fire department had notorious dead zones within high-rise buildings, particularly in the steel and concrete canyons of lower Manhattan. Firefighters climbing the stairwells of the Twin Towers found themselves ascending into an electronic void, their calls for backup or evacuation orders dissolving into static somewhere between the 30th and 40th floors. They were climbing blind, making life and death decisions based on information that was already minutes or hours out of date. Meanwhile, the 911 emergency system, designed to handle the routine crises of urban life, collapsed under the sheer volume of calls. Operators found themselves fielding thousands of simultaneous calls from people trapped in elevators, office workers watching the horror unfold from neighboring buildings, and family members desperately seeking information about loved ones. The system that was supposed to be the lifeline between civilians and emergency services became a bottleneck that delayed critical information for precious minutes. But perhaps most tragically, the communication failures weren't just technical, they were human. In the chaos of the morning, different agencies operated with different protocols, different assumptions, and different understandings of what was actually happening. The fire department, trained to fight fires and rescue people from burning buildings, approached the situation with the mindset of containing a blaze and evacuating civilians floor by floor. The police department, with their helicopters and broader tactical perspective, recognized much earlier that the buildings were in danger of total collapse. This disconnect created a deadly information gap. Police aviation units reported seeing visible signs of structural failure, with the North Tower's antenna beginning to lean and debris raining down in patterns that suggested imminent collapse. But this critical intelligence never reached the firefighters inside the buildings, who continued their rescue operations believing they were dealing with a conventional, if massive, fire emergency. They climbed the stairs with their 60-pound packs and specialized equipment, following protocols that assumed the building would remain standing long enough for them to do their jobs. The bureaucratic silos that seemed so logical during peacetime became death traps during crisis. Each agency had its own command structure, its own radio frequencies, its own assessment of the situation. The fire department set up their command post in the lobby of the North Tower. The police department established theirs blocks away, and the Port Authority coordinated from yet another location. Instead of a unified response, there were multiple responses, often working at cross purposes or duplicating efforts while critical gaps remained unfilled. Even when information did flow, it often arrived too late or in forms that couldn't be acted upon. The seismic sensors that detected the collapse of the South Tower registered the event, but by the time that information was processed and transmitted, the North Tower had already begun its own catastrophic descent. The evacuation orders that finally went out over fire department radios reached many firefighters only seconds before the buildings came down, leaving them no time to escape the stairwells they had been climbing for over an hour. The technological systems that were supposed to provide redundancy and backup communication proved to be single points of failure. When the main repeater for the fire department's radio system was damaged in the South Tower collapse, large portions of their communication network went dark. Cell phone towers, overwhelmed by the volume of calls and damaged by falling debris, provided sporadic service at best. Even the emergency broadcast systems that were meant to keep the public informed struggled to keep pace with rapidly evolving events. What emerged from the communication chaos was a picture of heroism operating in an information vacuum. First responders made split-second decisions based on incomplete or outdated information, often erring on the side of saving one more life rather than protecting their own safety. They shared what information they could through informal networks, shouting updates to colleagues they passed on the stairs, using hand signals when radios failed, and relying on the kind of institutional knowledge and professional instinct that can't be transmitted over any communication system. The civilians trapped in the towers faced their own communication nightmare. The public address systems in both buildings, when they functioned at all, provided contradictory guidance. Some announcements told people to remain at their desks and await further instructions, while others urged immediate evacuation. Phone calls to 911 resulted in operators who often knew less about the situation than the callers themselves. Family members trying to reach loved ones found the phone lines jammed or completely down, forcing them to rely on email, instant messaging, or simply waiting and hoping. In the end, the communication failures of September 11th revealed a fundamental truth about crisis management. When systems are pushed beyond their design limits, they don't fail gracefully or partially. They fail catastrophically and completely. The assumption that information would flow smoothly between agencies, that technology would bridge the gaps between different response organizations, and that established protocols would provide clear guidance in unprecedented situations proved to be dangerously naive. The heroes of that day succeeded not because of the communication systems, but in spite of them. They improvised, adapted, and made do with fragments of information and their own professional judgment. But for every act of heroism, there were missed opportunities, delayed responses, and tragic misunderstandings that cost lives. The communication breakdown wasn't just a technical failure. It was a systemic collapse that turned what should have been a coordinated response into a series of isolated, often contradictory efforts. As we examine these failures, we see how the complexity of modern emergency response systems can become their greatest vulnerability. The very sophistication that was meant to ensure seamless coordination during a crisis became a source of confusion and delay when those systems encountered something they were never designed to handle. The lesson isn't that the responders failed, but that they were operating with tools and protocols that were fundamentally inadequate for the unprecedented nature of the threat they faced. Now, as the towers burned and thousands found themselves trapped in scenarios beyond their worst nightmares, perhaps the most devastating factor wasn't the fire or smoke or structural damage. It was something far more basic, far more human: the complete and utter breakdown of information flow when you needed it most. Picture this. You're on the 84th floor of the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. when United Flight 175 slams into your building. The impact is violent, throwing you against walls, shattering windows, filling the air with debris and the acrid smell of jet fuel. Your ears are ringing, the lights are out. Emergency lighting flickers on and off like a dying heartbeat. And in this moment of absolute terror, when every second could mean the difference between life and death, you have no idea what's happening. No one does. The public address systems that were supposed to guide you to safety. Many were damaged or destroyed on impact. The emergency lighting that should have illuminated escape routes, flickering or completely dark in many stairwells. The fire wardens who were trained to help coordinate evacuations. Some were dead, others injured. Many simply couldn't reach the people who needed them most. This wasn't just a building emergency. This was the complete collapse of every information system that modern life depends on. No cell phones worked reliably. The circuits were overloaded, the towers damaged. No internet, no television broadcasts reaching the upper floors. No radio communications that could penetrate the steel and concrete maze of a modern skyscraper. You were flying blind in the most literal sense possible. In the North Tower, people above the impact zone had no way of knowing that the stairwells below them were blocked by debris, that the elevators weren't just broken but had become death traps, that the very structure of the building was compromised in ways that made traditional evacuation procedures not just useless, but potentially fatal. Some people made phone calls to loved ones, desperately seeking information about what was happening. But what could their families tell them? The news reports were confused, contradictory. Initial reports suggested a small plane, an accident. Even news anchors didn't understand the scope of what was unfolding. So family members found themselves in the impossible position of trying to provide guidance about a situation they couldn't comprehend, offering advice about escape routes they'd never seen, making life or death recommendations based on information that was hours behind the reality their loved ones were living. The people trapped in the towers were essentially making decisions in a complete information vacuum. Should they try to go up to the roof and wait for helicopter rescue? Should they attempt to descend through smoke-filled stairwells? Should they stay put and wait for help? Every choice carried potentially fatal consequences, and there was no reliable way to know which choice was correct. This information blackout created a cruel paradox. The people who most desperately needed accurate, real-time information about their situation were the same people who had the least access to it. While news organizations were broadcasting live coverage to the world, the people actually inside the buildings were operating with less information than viewers watching television in their living rooms thousands of miles away. Some of the most heartbreaking phone calls from that day capture this information disconnect. People calling to say goodbye, asking their loved ones to tell them what they were seeing on television, trying to piece together their situation from second-hand reports that were already outdated by the time they reached them. The building's own communication systems, designed for normal emergencies, were completely overwhelmed. The emergency command centers that should have been coordinating response efforts were either destroyed or cut off from the people they were supposed to help. Radio frequencies were jammed. Backup systems failed. Even the first responders, the firefighters, and police officers racing up the stairwells were operating with radically incomplete information. Many didn't know a second plane had hit. Some didn't realize how severe the structural damage was. They were making tactical decisions based on protocols designed for conventional fires, not for a completely unprecedented catastrophe. The Port Authority police helicopter pilots circling the towers could see that the upper floors were becoming increasingly untenable, but they couldn't land on the roofs to evacuate people. The rooftops were locked, filled with smoke, or simply too dangerous to access. But the people trapped inside had no way of knowing that roof rescue wasn't coming. This created false hope and wasted precious time as people climbed toward rooftops that would never see rescue helicopters, when they might have had better chances attempting the dangerous descent through the stairwells. The failure of information systems also meant that successful evacuation strategies couldn't be shared. When people in one part of a building found a passable stairwell or a safe route, there was no way to communicate that information to others who might benefit from it. Each group of survivors was essentially solving the same deadly puzzle in isolation, unable to learn from each other's discoveries. Temperature readings, air quality measurements, structural assessments, all the technical data that might have helped people make informed decisions about whether to shelter in place or attempt evacuation, simply wasn't available to the people who needed it most. The psychological impact of this information void was devastating. Humans can endure tremendous hardship when they understand their situation and have some sense of control over their fate. But being trapped in a life-threatening situation with no reliable information about what's happening or what options are available triggers a special kind of terror that can paralyze decision-making precisely when quick, clear thinking is most essential. Some people spent precious time trying to gather information rather than taking immediate action. Others made snap decisions based on incomplete or incorrect assumptions. The lack of reliable information turned an already impossible situation into a deadly guessing game where every choice could be your last. And perhaps most cruelly of all, even when accurate information was available, it often couldn't reach the people who needed it. Emergency broadcasts were being transmitted, but the people trapped in the towers couldn't receive them. Expert advice was being offered by structural engineers and emergency management specialists, but it couldn't penetrate the communication blackouts surrounding the disaster zone. The information systems that we take for granted in our daily lives, cell phones, internet, radio, television, even basic building public address systems, all failed simultaneously when they were needed most. It was like being thrust back into a pre-technological age at the moment when modern technological solutions were desperately needed. This wasn't just an equipment failure. It was a complete breakdown of the information infrastructure that modern emergency response depends on. And in that breakdown, thousands of people found themselves making life or death decisions with less information than their ancestors might have had in much simpler emergencies. The silence itself became another killer on September 11th. Not the dramatic, visible killer of fire and smoke and falling debris, but the quiet, insidious killer of isolation and uncertainty. In our hyper-connected world, the sudden severing of all communication links created a kind of sensory deprivation that left people emotionally and psychologically adrift at the moment they most needed clarity and guidance. So as you lie there in the quiet of your room, with your phone nearby and the internet at your fingertips, remember that on September 11th, thousands of people faced the unthinkable without any of the tools we now consider essential for navigating even minor emergencies. They were alone with their fear, their incomplete knowledge, and their impossible choices. The attacks didn't just destroy buildings and take lives. They shattered the assumption that information would be available when you needed it most. That help would be coordinated and effective, that the systems designed to protect you would function when tested by the unthinkable. In the end, survival often came down not to following official procedures or waiting for authoritative guidance, but to making gut decisions based on incomplete information and trusting instincts that had never been tested in anything remotely resembling these circumstances. The people who survived were often those who acted quickly on limited information rather than those who waited for clarity that would never come. But even they couldn't have known that at the time. In the information void of September 11th, every choice was a leap of faith into an unknowable darkness. The night grows deeper now, and as we reach the final chapter of our journey through medieval romance, we find ourselves confronting perhaps the most heartbreaking truth of all. For even those who managed to navigate the treacherous waters of courtship, even those who found genuine love despite impossible odds, even those who survived the accusations and the violence and the supernatural terror, there remained one final enemy that no mortal could defeat. Death itself was the ultimate destroyer of medieval romance, arriving not with fanfare or warning, but with the quiet certainty of winter frost. In a world where the average lifespan barely reached 40 years, where disease could claim a life in days, where childbirth was a gamble with mortality, love was always racing against time. Imagine Thomas and Eleanor, peasants who somehow found each other amid the constraints of feudal life. They managed to marry for affection rather than arrangement, a rare blessing in their harsh world. For 5 precious years, they carved out moments of happiness between the endless cycles of planting and harvest. They shared quiet conversations by firelight, gentle touches when no one was watching, whispered dreams of a better future for their children. But when the sweating sickness came to their village, it took Eleanor in 3 days. Thomas held her hand as fever consumed her body, watching helplessly as the woman he loved faded into shadow. There was no medicine that could save her, no prayer that could turn back time, no bargain he could strike with death itself. Eleanor died as she had lived, quietly and without ceremony. Thomas buried her in the village churchyard beneath a simple wooden cross, and within a year he too was gone, claimed by grief and the same disease that had taken his wife. Their love story, brief and beautiful and utterly forgotten by history, was the true romance of medieval times. For this was the cruel irony of medieval love. In a world that desperately needed connection, that craved warmth in the face of overwhelming darkness, that sought meaning amid constant suffering, the very act of loving made loss inevitable. The deeper the affection, the more devastating the separation. The stronger the bond, the more complete the breaking. Medieval people learned to love with the knowledge that heartbreak was not just possible, but promised. They opened their hearts, knowing they would be shattered. They made vows knowing they would be broken, not by betrayal or choice, but by the simple, inexorable passage of time. And yet, they loved anyway, despite the diseases and the dangers, despite the social constraints and the supernatural fears, despite the knowledge that every kiss might be the last. They loved. They chose connection over safety, vulnerability over protection, hope over despair. Perhaps that is the true lesson of medieval romance. Not that love was a nightmare, but that it was worth having even when it led to heartbreak. That the brief candle flame of human affection was worth lighting even in the face of endless darkness. That the courage to love, knowing it would end in loss, was perhaps the most heroic act of all. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, remember Thomas and Eleanor, and the countless others whose names have been lost to time. Remember that love has always required bravery, that connection has always demanded sacrifice, that the human heart has always chosen to hope, despite overwhelming evidence that hope leads to sorrow. Their world was indeed a nightmare for lovers, filled with dangers we can barely imagine. But they loved anyway, and in doing so, they lit small fires against the darkness that still warm us today, centuries later, reminding us that even in the bleakest of times, the human capacity for affection endures. The medieval night is quiet now. The monsters sleep in their caves. The accusations have been silenced. The supernatural terrors have faded into memory. All that remains is the echo of ancient hearts that dare to love despite everything, their courage still whispering across the centuries, gentle as a lullaby, soft as the breath of those long gone but never truly forgotten. Rest now, knowing that love survives even the darkest ages, and that somewhere in the shadows of history, Thomas still reaches for Eleanor's hand, and she still smiles back at him, and their brief, beautiful, doomed romance still matters, still means something, still lights a candle against the endless medieval night. The most terrifying aspect of medieval dating wasn't the physical dangers, or even the supernatural fears we've explored. It was something far more insidious, something that crept into every whispered conversation and stolen glance. It was the complete and utter absence of choice, the systematic destruction of human agency that turned love itself into a form of imprisonment. Picture this. You're a young woman named Isabel, living in 14th century France. You're 16, which by medieval standards makes you practically ancient for marriage. You've somehow managed to avoid the typical fate of being betrothed at 12, married at 14, and pregnant by 15. But your luck is about to run out because your father has just announced your engagement to a man you've never met. His name is Lord Bertrand, and he's 43 years old. He's been married twice before. Both wives died in childbirth, which everyone agrees is terribly sad, but certainly not his fault. After all, women dying in labour was just the natural order of things, wasn't it? The fact that neighbours whisper about his temper, about the bruises his first wife tried to hide, about the way servants flinch when he raises his voice, well, that's just gossip. And gossip, your father reminds you, is the devil's work. You have no say in this arrangement. None whatsoever. Your feelings, your hopes, your dreams for the future, they're not just irrelevant. They're actually dangerous. Because in medieval society, a woman who expressed preferences about her romantic life was displaying the same prideful rebellion that had led Eve to damn all of mankind. Your role is to submit, to accept whatever husband your father deems appropriate, and to consider yourself fortunate that you're being provided for at all. But let's imagine for a moment that you're brave enough, or foolish enough to object. Let's say you gather your courage and tell your father that you don't want to marry Lord Bertrand, that you've heard troubling things about his treatment of women, that you fear for your safety. What happens then? First, you'll be reminded that marriage is not about your personal happiness. It's about securing alliances, consolidating property, ensuring the continuation of bloodlines. Your comfort, your safety, even your life, these are secondary considerations at best. The arrangement with Lord Bertrand brings your family a substantial dowry, connections to powerful nobles, and protection from rival clans. Your objections are not just selfish, they're potentially treasonous to your family's interests. If you persist in your resistance, the consequences escalate quickly. You might be locked in your room, deprived of food until you come to your senses. You might be sent to a convent, not as a nun, but as a kind of prisoner, kept there until you agree to the marriage. You might be beaten, because physical discipline was not just legally permitted, but religiously mandated. The church taught that just as Christ ruled over the church, so must a father rule over his daughter, with absolute authority and the right to use whatever force necessary to maintain order. And if you still refuse, if you somehow manage to escape, to run away, to seek sanctuary elsewhere, you'll discover that there is nowhere to go. Medieval society offered no shelters for runaway daughters, no legal protections for women fleeing arranged marriages, no economic opportunities that would allow you to support yourself independently. You would be a fugitive, hunted by your own family, rejected by a society that saw your resistance as evidence of moral corruption. But perhaps you're thinking that surely, if you explained your situation to the right people, if you appealed to the church or to other nobles, someone would help you. Someone would see the injustice of forcing a young woman into a marriage she feared. But you would be wrong, because the entire system was designed to prevent exactly this kind of resistance. The church, which you might hope would offer sanctuary, would instead lecture you about wifely submission. Priests would remind you that marriage was a sacrament, that your duty to obey your father was ordained by God himself. They would tell you that your fears about Lord Bertrand were probably exaggerated, that a woman's natural tendency toward hysteria was making you imagine dangers that didn't exist. They would assure you that once you were properly married, once you submitted to your husband's authority and began bearing children, you would find the contentment that God intended for all women. Other nobles would be even less sympathetic. They had daughters of their own to marry off, alliances of their own to secure. The last thing they wanted was to encourage the dangerous idea that women should have a say in their own marriages. If word spread that young women could simply refuse arrangements made by their fathers, the entire social order would be threatened. Property rights, inheritance laws, political stability, all of it depended on women accepting their designated roles without question. Even other women would offer little support. Your own mother, your sisters, your female relatives, they had all been through the same system. They had all been forced into marriages they didn't choose, had all learned to make the best of situations they couldn't change. Some might privately sympathize with your plight, but publicly they would pressure you to accept your fate. Because admitting that your situation was unjust would mean admitting that their own lives had been unjust, and that was too painful a truth to acknowledge. So you would find yourself completely alone, facing a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Submit to the marriage and accept whatever consequences followed, or resist and face social ostracism, economic ruin, and quite possibly death. Most young women chose submission, not because they were weak or cowardly, but because the alternative was literally unthinkable. This systematic destruction of female agency extended far beyond marriage arrangements. It infected every aspect of romantic relationships, turning what should have been natural human connections into elaborate performances of power and control. Even courtship, when it was allowed to occur at all, was heavily scripted and closely supervised. If you were permitted to meet your intended husband before the wedding, these encounters would take place under the watchful eyes of family members and religious authorities. You would not be allowed to speak freely, to ask questions about his character or intentions, to express any preferences or concerns. Your role was to demonstrate your suitability as a wife through your silence, your modesty, your complete deference to male authority. Any attempt to assert yourself, to show intelligence or independence, would be seen as evidence that you had been improperly raised, that you lacked the submissive nature essential to a good wife. A woman who spoke too much, who asked too many questions, who seemed too confident or self-assured, was automatically suspect. She might be accused of pride, of vanity, of the kind of intellectual curiosity that was seen as inherently dangerous in women. The courtship rituals themselves were designed to reinforce these power dynamics. A man might send gifts, write letters, or compose poetry for the object of his affection, but these gestures were not about winning her love or approval. They were about demonstrating his worthiness to her family, his ability to provide for her, his commitment to the economic and political arrangements being negotiated. The woman's feelings about these offerings were irrelevant. Even the language used to describe these relationships revealed their true nature. Women were not courted or wooed, they were pursued or won or claimed. They were not partners in romance, they were prizes to be captured, territory to be conquered, property to be acquired. The vocabulary of love was the vocabulary of warfare and ownership, and everyone understood exactly what that meant. This complete absence of agency created a kind of psychological torture that's difficult for modern minds to comprehend. Imagine knowing that every major decision about your life, every choice that would determine your happiness or misery, your safety or danger, your very survival would be made by someone else. Imagine being told from childhood that your own thoughts and feelings were not just unimportant but actively dangerous, that expressing preferences or desires was evidence of moral corruption. Many women simply broke under this pressure. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of young women who fell into deep melancholy after being informed of their marriage arrangements, who refused to eat or speak or leave their rooms. Others turned to desperate measures, attempting to injure themselves in ways that would make them unsuitable for marriage, or even taking their own lives rather than face a future they couldn't control. But perhaps most tragically, many women learned to internalize their oppression so completely that they genuinely believed it was natural and right. They convinced themselves that their lack of choice was actually a form of protection, that their submission was a sign of virtue, that their suffering was part of God's plan. They became willing participants in their own subjugation, passing down to their daughters the same lessons of powerlessness and resignation that had been forced upon them. This internalized oppression created a vicious cycle that perpetuated itself across generations. Mothers who had never known freedom couldn't teach their daughters to value it. Women who had never experienced genuine choice couldn't recognize its absence as a form of violence. The system was so complete, so totalizing, that it became nearly impossible to imagine any alternative. And yet, somehow, love persisted. Even in this nightmare of control and coercion, human hearts continued to reach for connection. Young people still fell in love, still dreamed of partnership and intimacy, still hoped for something better than the cold arrangements that defined their world. Their love was constrained, threatened, often crushed, but it survived in hidden moments and whispered conversations, in stolen glances and secret promises. These forbidden feelings created their own form of torment. To love someone you couldn't be with, to yearn for a life you couldn't have, to dream of choices you would never be given. This was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Medieval literature is filled with stories of star-crossed lovers, of passion that could never be fulfilled, of hearts that broke under the weight of impossible circumstances. These weren't just romantic fantasies, they were reflections of lived reality for countless people trapped in a system that treated love as a luxury they couldn't afford. The few who dared to follow their hearts, who chose love over duty or personal happiness over family obligation, paid a terrible price. They were cast out, disinherited, sometimes killed. Their stories became cautionary tales, warnings to others about what happened when people forgot their place in the social order. But they also became legends, proof that even in the darkest times, the human spirit could still choose rebellion over submission, love over fear. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, in your warm bed with your freedom intact, remember Isabel and the countless women like her who never had a choice in matters of the heart. Remember that the right to choose your own partner, to marry for love rather than obligation, to leave relationships that make you unhappy. These are not ancient privileges, but recent victories in humanity's long struggle for dignity and autonomy. The medieval world may be long gone, but its echoes still reverberate through our understanding of love and power, choice and control. In understanding how completely agency was destroyed in that distant time, we can better appreciate how precious and fragile our freedoms truly are. And perhaps, in honoring the memory of those who suffered without choice, we can commit ourselves to protecting the rights that they could only dream of having. The night is quiet now. The medieval world faded into history. The chains of arranged marriage have been broken. The walls of patriarchal control have crumbled. You are free to love whom you choose, to make your own decisions, to shape your own destiny. Sleep peacefully in that freedom, and let the stories of the past remind you never to take it for granted. As twilight settles around you like a familiar blanket, let us turn our attention to something that might seem strange in this peaceful hour. We've journeyed through the chaos of 9/11, explored the brutal realities of medieval romance, and witnessed the transformation of love into legend. But now, as the world grows quiet and your breathing slows, we find ourselves facing perhaps the most profound truth of all. That even in our darkest moments, even when systems fail and hearts break, something endures. Something that transcends the immediate pain and reaches toward meaning. You see, what we've discovered in these stories isn't just suffering. It's the remarkable human capacity to find connection in the midst of disconnection. to create beauty from brutality, to transform personal catastrophe into shared understanding. The survivors of 9/11 didn't just endure that terrible day. They carried forward stories of strangers helping strangers, of love declared in final phone calls, of ordinary people becoming extraordinary in their compassion. The medieval lovers we encountered, constrained by impossible circumstances, still managed to love so deeply that their stories echo across centuries, becoming the very foundation of how we understand romance today. And perhaps this is the secret that emerges from our exploration of human resilience. When everything we thought we could depend on crumbles, when the systems designed to protect us fail, when love itself seems impossible, there remains something unbreakable at the core of human experience. It's not hope, exactly, though hope is part of it. It's not faith, though faith sustains it. It's something deeper and more fundamental. The recognition that we are not alone in our struggles, that others have walked these dark paths before us, and that their survival makes our own possible. Think of the medieval lovers who defied church and state to follow their hearts. Their individual stories often ended in tragedy, yes, but collectively they created a tradition of romantic love that eventually transformed the very institutions that had oppressed them. The arranged marriages that once dominated European society gave way over centuries to the radical idea that people should choose their own partners based on affection and compatibility. The Church's harsh teachings about sexuality softened into a more compassionate understanding of human intimacy. The rigid class barriers that prevented love across social lines gradually weakened under the persistent pressure of human longing. In the same way, the chaos and failure we witnessed on 9/11 led not just to grief, but to growth. The breakdown of communication systems sparked innovations in emergency response. The vulnerability exposed by the attacks prompted a deeper examination of what truly matters in life. The fear and anger that initially divided communities eventually gave way to a more profound sense of shared humanity. From the rubble of that terrible day emerged countless acts of heroism, kindness, and love that continue to ripple outward through time. This is what makes our species remarkable. Not that we avoid suffering, but that we transform it. We take the raw material of pain, loss, and confusion and somehow alchemize it into wisdom, art, and connection. The medieval troubadours turned their impossible love into poetry that still moves us today. The survivors of tragedy become the teachers who help others navigate similar darkness. The broken systems become the blueprints for better ones. As you lie there in the gentle darkness, consider this. Your own struggles, whatever they may be, are part of this same ancient and ongoing process. The heartbreak you've experienced, the disappointments that have shaped you, the moments when you felt most alone, these are not evidence of your failure or the world's cruelty. They are your contributions to the great human project of meaning-making. Your threads in the tapestry of resilience that connects you to every person who has ever loved deeply, lost profoundly, and somehow found the strength to continue. The medieval lovers knew this intuitively. They understood that their individual stories of passion and tragedy were part of something larger, a grand narrative about the human capacity to love despite impossible odds. They accepted that their own happiness might be sacrificed so that future generations could love more freely. Their suffering was not meaningless. It was generative, creating the very possibility of the love stories we tell today. And the survivors of 9/11, in their own way, have done the same. Their experiences of terror and loss have been transformed into memorials that honor the dead, policies that protect the living, and stories that remind us of our fundamental interconnectedness. Their individual traumas have become collective wisdom, their personal grief a shared commitment to building a world where such suffering is less likely to occur. This transformation doesn't happen automatically, of course. It requires what we might call moral imagination, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances toward larger patterns and possibilities. It requires courage to believe that meaning can emerge from meaninglessness, that connection can arise from isolation, that love can flourish even in the harshest conditions. And it requires time, the long, slow work of turning pain into purpose, grief into grace. But here's what's truly remarkable. This work doesn't require you to be a hero or a saint. It doesn't demand that you accomplish great deeds or change the world in dramatic ways. The medieval peasant woman who loved her husband despite the church's teachings that passion was sinful was doing this work. The office worker who helped a stranger down the stairs of the World Trade Center was doing this work. Every time you choose compassion over cynicism, connection over isolation, hope over despair, you are participating in this ancient human tradition of creating meaning from chaos. As sleep begins to claim you, let yourself feel the weight of this legacy. You are heir to centuries of human beings who faced impossible circumstances and somehow found ways to love, to create, to endure. Their strength flows through you, their wisdom guides you, their hope sustains you. You are not facing your struggles alone. You are accompanied by the countless souls who have walked similar paths and emerged, if not unscathed, then transformed. And perhaps most importantly, you are not just the beneficiary of this legacy. You are its author. Your choices, your love, your resilience in the face of difficulty are adding new chapters to this ongoing story of human transcendence. The way you respond to your own challenges, the kindness you show to others in their dark moments, the meaning you create from your experiences, all of this becomes part of the great reservoir of wisdom and strength that future generations will draw upon. So rest now, knowing that your struggles have purpose, your love has power, and your story matters. You are part of something larger than yourself, something that began in the caves of our earliest ancestors and will continue long after you are gone. You are a thread in the tapestry of human resilience, a note in the great symphony of survival, a word in the endless poem of hope that our species has been writing since we first learned to love. The darkness around you is not empty. It is full of the presence of all those who have found their way through similar nights. The silence is not void. It is pregnant with the possibility of new dawns, new loves, new stories of triumph over adversity. You are held by this vast community of the human heart, supported by the strength of all who have ever loved deeply and lost profoundly, and somehow found the courage to love again. Sleep well, knowing that your story is part of the greatest story ever told. The story of a species that refuses to let suffering have the final word, that insists on finding light in the darkest places, that believes against all evidence to the contrary, that love is stronger than death, hope more powerful than despair, and connection more real than separation. Tomorrow you will wake to write another page in this endless book of human resilience. But tonight, you rest in the knowledge that you are not alone, you are not forgotten, and your struggles are not meaningless. You are part of the great human family, and your love, your pain, your hope, and your dreams are all threads in the tapestry that connects us all. Rest now, dear listener. The world is safely held, your story is safely told, and your heart is safely home. But as we reach the end of our journey through the nightmare that was medieval dating, we must confront perhaps the most haunting truth of all. These weren't just stories of individual suffering. These weren't merely isolated tales of broken hearts and shattered dreams. What we've uncovered is evidence of an entire civilization that had systematically transformed humanity's most beautiful and natural impulse, the desire for love and connection, into a source of terror, shame, and death. The medieval world didn't just make dating difficult, it made love itself dangerous. Every emotion that should have brought joy instead brought fear. Every feeling that should have connected souls instead isolated them. The very act of caring for another person became an invitation to accusation, persecution, and destruction. Consider the psychological devastation this must have wrought on entire generations. Children grew up learning to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potentially evil or supernatural. Young people entered adulthood already broken, already taught that their most human desires were evidence of corruption or demonic influence. The damage wasn't just to individuals, but to the very fabric of human connection itself. The medieval church, which should have been a source of comfort and guidance, instead became an engine of romantic terror. Religious authorities who claimed to represent divine love systematically destroyed earthly love, turning natural affection into sin and genuine passion into evidence of damnation. They created a world where the only safe emotion was fear, where the only acceptable desire was for death and the afterlife. And what of the women who lived through this nightmare? They bore the heaviest burden of all. Beautiful women faced accusations of witchcraft. Independent women were suspected of demonic possession. Women who inspired desire were blamed for corruption they never sought. Even women who simply survived their circumstances too successfully risked being labelled as supernatural threats. The legal systems that should have protected the innocent instead provided machinery for destroying them. Courts that claimed to seek justice instead offered platforms for persecution. Laws that promised order instead delivered chaos, turning neighbours against neighbours and families against their own members. The economic structures made everything worse. Love became a luxury that only the wealthy could afford, and even then only briefly. For the vast majority of people, romantic relationships were transactions of survival rather than expressions of affection. The desperate struggle simply to stay alive left no room for the gentler emotions, no space for courtship or connection. But perhaps most tragically of all, this system was self-perpetuating. Each generation taught the next to fear love, to suspect passion, to view romantic connection as dangerous. The victims became the enforcers, passing down the same terrors that had destroyed their own chances for happiness. The cycle of romantic oppression continued not just through force, but through the internalized belief that it was necessary, even holy. Medieval dating was a nightmare because it represented the complete triumph of fear over love, of control over connection, of death over life. It was a world where the very forces that should have protected and nurtured human relationships instead devoted themselves to crushing them. The superstitious terrors we explored weren't just beliefs, they were weapons. The Church's teachings weren't just doctrine, they were tools of control. The social restrictions weren't just customs, they were prisons. Together, they created a civilization that had declared war on its own humanity. And yet somehow, love survived. Despite everything we've uncovered, despite the overwhelming evidence of systematic romantic oppression, people continued to fall in love. They continued to risk everything for moments of connection. They continued to believe that somewhere, somehow, genuine affection was possible. The letters that survive from this period, hidden in monastery archives and family collections, tell stories of love that persisted despite impossible odds. The songs that troubadours sang, even as they celebrated impossible and tragic relationships, kept alive the dream of romantic fulfillment. The very myths and stories that warned against love also preserved its memory, ensuring that future generations would remember what had been lost. This persistence of love in the face of such overwhelming opposition represents perhaps the most remarkable testament to human resilience in all of history. These medieval lovers who dared to follow their hearts, despite the supernatural terrors, social constraints, and physical dangers surrounding them, were heroes in the truest sense. They fought not with swords, but with emotions, not against armies, but against entire civilizations determined to crush their spirits. Their courage echoes across the centuries, reminding us that even in the darkest times, even when every institution conspires against human connection, love finds a way, not always successfully, not often safely, but persistently, stubbornly, beautifully. When we complain about modern dating, when we feel frustrated with apps that don't work or relationships that disappoint, we should remember these forgotten souls. We should think of Margaret trembling at her wedding to a man she feared. We should remember the countless women burned as witches for the crime of being loved. We should honour the memory of all those young people who died simply for daring to believe that their hearts might guide them toward happiness. The medieval nightmare of dating teaches us that romantic freedom isn't just a luxury or a modern invention. It's a fundamental human right that was systematically denied for centuries. The ability to choose our own partners, to express our desires without fear of persecution, to love without risking our lives. These aren't privileges to be taken lightly. They're victories won through the suffering of countless generations who came before us. As we drift off to sleep tonight, safe in our beds, free to love whom we choose, let us spare a thought for those who lived and died in that distant darkness. Let us remember that the freedom to follow our hearts, which seems so natural to us now, was once considered dangerous, heretical, and impossible. Their stories, preserved in fragments and whispers across the centuries, remind us that love is stronger than fear, that human connection is more powerful than oppression, and that even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn. The medieval nightmare is over. Love, battered but unbroken, has survived to see the light. As we reflect on these interconnected threads of human experience, from the collapse of the Twin Towers to the rigid constraints of medieval society, we begin to understand that survival has never been just about physical endurance. It has always been about the preservation of something deeper, something that transcends the immediate moment of crisis. The people who faced those final moments on September 11th were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting to maintain their connection to love, to family, to meaning itself. The phone calls made from the towers and the hijacked planes reveal this truth most powerfully. In those desperate minutes, people did not spend their time cursing fate or dwelling on the failures of emergency systems. They spoke words of love. They forgave old grievances. They shared final moments of tenderness with spouses, children, and friends. These conversations, preserved in the records of that day, demonstrate that even when all systems fail, even when every protocol breaks down, the human heart continues to seek connection. Consider the story of Brian Sweeney, a passenger on United Flight 175, who left a voicemail for his wife, Julie, that would later become one of the most heart-wrenching testimonies of that day. His voice, calm despite the chaos around him, carried a message that transcended the immediate horror. He spoke of love, of the life they had built together, of hopes for her future happiness, even without him. This was not the voice of someone who had given up on survival, but rather someone who understood that survival itself is meaningless, without love to give it purpose. The medieval lovers we have discussed throughout this exploration would have recognized this sentiment immediately. Trapped in their own systems of control, facing their own impossible odds, they too understood that love could transform even the most desperate circumstances into something meaningful. The difference, perhaps, is that the medieval lovers had time to develop elaborate codes and rituals around their defiance, while those facing the collapse of the towers had only minutes to distill a lifetime of love into final words. The communication failures of September 11th take on an even more tragic dimension. when we consider how they prevented not just physical rescue, but emotional connection. The overwhelmed phone networks meant that many people who desperately wanted to reach their loved ones were unable to do so. The failed radio systems meant that first responders could not coordinate their efforts or share vital information. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all, these communication breakdowns meant that countless final words of love were never spoken. Countless opportunities for closure were lost forever. This mirrors, in its own way, the enforced silences of medieval society. Just as the church and feudal system worked to prevent the free expression of love and desire, the technological failures of September 11th created barriers between people who needed desperately to connect. The difference is that medieval oppression was intentional, designed to maintain control, while the communication failures of 9/11 were the result of systems simply being overwhelmed by circumstances no one had imagined possible. The outdated emergency protocols we discussed earlier represent another form of systematic failure that costs lives. These protocols, developed for a different era and different types of emergencies, could not adapt quickly enough to the unprecedented nature of the attacks. The instruction for people to remain at their desks, the lack of coordination between different emergency services, the absence of clear evacuation procedures for such a massive disaster, all of these failures echo the rigid thinking that characterized medieval approaches to love and human nature. Medieval society's inability to adapt to the reality of human emotion and desire led to centuries of suffering and suppression. Similarly, the inability of emergency systems to adapt to the reality of the September 11th attacks led to preventable deaths and unnecessary tragedy. In both cases, the failure was not primarily one of individual courage or strength, but of systems that were inadequate to the human realities they were meant to serve. Yet even within these systematic failures, individual acts of heroism and love continued to flourish. The firefighters who climbed the stairs of the collapsing towers, knowing they might not return, were driven by the same impulse that motivated medieval lovers to risk everything for a moment of genuine connection. The office workers who helped colleagues they barely knew, the strangers who comforted each other in stairwells, the passengers who fought back against their hijackers, all of these actions represent the triumph of human connection over systematic failure. The story of Wells Crowther, the man in the red bandana who saved numerous lives before perishing in the South Tower, exemplifies this triumph. Working as an equities trader, he could have focused solely on his own escape when the planes hit. Instead, he used his knowledge of the building and his natural leadership to guide others to safety. Survivors remember him not for his words, but for his actions, for the way he embodied care and protection in the midst of chaos. His red bandana became a symbol not of the systems that failed that day, but of the human capacity to create meaning and connection even in the darkest moments. This capacity for creating meaning in the face of suffering connects directly to the experiences of medieval lovers, who found ways to express deep emotion despite living in societies that sought to control and suppress such feelings. The courtly love tradition, for all its constraints and artificial conventions, represented an attempt to create space for genuine human feeling within an oppressive system. The troubadours and their audiences understood that love could not be eliminated by decree or doctrine, that it would find expression regardless of the risks involved. The letters and poems that survive from medieval lovers reveal the same desperate desire for connection that we hear in the final phone calls from September 11th. The language may be different, the circumstances may be separated by centuries, but the fundamental human need to love and be loved remains constant. Whether facing the immediate threat of collapsing buildings or the long-term oppression of social control, people have always found ways to affirm their connections to each other. The physical dangers of September 11th, the smoke and heat and structural collapse, created immediate threats that required split-second decisions. But the psychological dangers, the fear and confusion and sense of helplessness required a different kind of survival strategy. Many of the survivors report that their ability to cope came not from following official procedures, but from forming connections with others around them. Strangers became allies, colleagues became family, and these bonds provided the emotional strength necessary to continue fighting for survival. Medieval society, with its emphasis on hierarchy and control, worked actively to prevent such spontaneous connections. The elaborate rules governing interaction between social classes, the restrictions on movement and association, the constant surveillance by religious and secular authorities, all of these mechanisms were designed to prevent people from forming the kinds of bonds that might challenge existing power structures. Yet even within these constraints, people found ways to connect, to care for each other, to create pockets of genuine human warmth in an otherwise cold and controlling world. The servants who carried messages between lovers, the monks who preserved romantic poetry despite official disapproval, the nobles who risked their positions to protect those they cared about, all of these individuals understood that human connection was worth the risk of punishment. Their actions, like those of the heroes of September 11th, demonstrate that love and compassion are not luxuries that can be set aside in times of crisis, but essential elements of what makes survival worthwhile. As we consider why someone might not have survived September 11th, we must acknowledge that survival depended on factors far beyond individual control. The floors you happen to be on, the timing of your arrival at work, the functioning of elevators and stairwells, the behavior of others around you, all of these elements played crucial roles in determining who lived and who died. But within these constraints, the people who had the best chance of survival were often those who understood the importance of human connection, who helped others, even when it might have slowed their own escape, who maintained hope and purpose even in the darkest moments. This lesson extends far beyond the specific circumstances of September 11th. Throughout history, the people who have survived the most difficult circumstances have often been those who maintained their capacity for love and connection. The Holocaust survivors, who formed bonds with fellow prisoners, the refugees who created communities in displacement, the victims of natural disasters who worked together rather than competing for resources. All of these examples demonstrate that survival is rarely a solitary achievement. The medieval lovers we have discussed understood this truth intuitively. Their willingness to risk everything for love was not simply romantic foolishness, but a recognition that life without connection is not truly life at all. The troubadour who faced exile for his poetry, the lady who risked her reputation for a moment of genuine affection, the knight who challenged social convention for the sake of his heart, all of these individuals chose meaningful connection over mere survival. The systems that failed on September 11th, the communication networks and emergency protocols and building designs, were all created with the best intentions. They represented genuine attempts to protect people and save lives. But they were designed by people who could not imagine the full scope of human evil or the complete breakdown of normal circumstances. Similarly, the social and religious systems of medieval Europe were often created by people who genuinely believed they were protecting society from chaos and immorality. The tragedy in both cases is that these well-intentioned systems often prevented the very connections that give life meaning and provide the strength necessary for survival. The rigid protocols that kept people at their desks instead of evacuating, the communication failures that prevented coordination and final conversations, the physical barriers that trapped people in collapsing buildings. All of these systematic failures made survival more difficult and death more likely. Medieval society's systematic suppression of love and individual choice created different but equally tragic barriers to human flourishing. The young woman forced into marriage with a stranger, the man forbidden to pursue his heart's desire, the lovers separated by artificial social boundaries. All of these individuals faced their own forms of systematic oppression that made authentic life more difficult and spiritual death more likely. Yet in both contexts, people found ways to transcend these systematic limitations. The survivors of September 11th often report that their experience, despite its horror, taught them valuable lessons about what truly matters in life. They speak of letting go of petty grievances, of prioritizing relationships over career advancement, of finding meaning in service to others rather than personal achievement. These lessons, born from the most difficult circumstances imaginable, echo the wisdom that medieval lovers discovered through their own struggles against systematic oppression. The phone calls from September 11th, those final conversations between people who knew they might never speak again, represent some of the most profound expressions of love in human history. Stripped of artifice and social convention, facing the ultimate crisis, these conversations revealed the essential truths that people carry in their hearts. The words spoken in those final moments, preserved in voicemails and remembered by surviving family members, demonstrate that love is not diminished by crisis, but rather purified and intensified by it. Medieval lovers, facing their own forms of ultimate crisis, discovered similar truths. The poetry they created, the letters they exchanged, the risks they took for moments of genuine connection, all of these actions revealed the same essential understanding that love is not a luxury but a necessity, not a weakness but a source of strength, not a distraction from life's serious business, but life's most serious business. The buildings that collapsed on September 11th were marvels of human engineering, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge about construction and design. Yet they could not withstand the unprecedented forces unleashed that day. Similarly, the social structures of medieval Europe, refined over generations and supported by the most powerful institutions of their time, could not ultimately suppress the human need for love and connection. Both sets of structures, despite their apparent strength, proved vulnerable to forces they had not been designed to handle. This vulnerability is not a sign of failure, but of the limits of human planning and control. We cannot create systems that anticipate every possible crisis or suppress every potentially disruptive human emotion. The lesson from both September 11th and medieval history is not that we should abandon our efforts to create protective structures, but that we should design them with humility, recognizing that they will inevitably be tested by circumstances we cannot foresee and human needs we cannot fully control. The first responders who rushed into the collapsing towers, the office workers who helped strangers find their way to safety, the passengers who fought back against their hijackers, all of these individuals made choices that transcended the failed systems around them. They acted from love, from duty, from a recognition that their own survival was meaningless unless it served something larger than themselves. Their actions, like those of medieval lovers who risked everything for authentic connection, demonstrate that human beings are capable of transcending the limitations of the systems that surround them. As we conclude this exploration of survival, love, and human resilience across the centuries, we must acknowledge that the question of why someone might not have survived September 11th cannot be answered simply. Physical factors, systematic failures, timing, and pure chance all played crucial roles. But perhaps the deeper question is not why some people died, but why others lived, and what they chose to do with the life they were given. The survivors of September 11th, like the medieval lovers who found ways to express authentic emotion despite systematic oppression, understood that survival itself is not the ultimate goal. The goal is to live in a way that honors the connections we have with others, that creates meaning from suffering, that transforms individual experience into something that serves the larger human story. The people who died on September 11th, in their final moments of love and sacrifice, achieved this goal as fully as those who lived. The lessons we can draw from this exploration extend far beyond the specific circumstances of any single historical moment. They remind us that human beings are remarkably resilient, capable of finding love and meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. They teach us that systematic failures, whether in emergency response or social control, cannot ultimately defeat the human capacity for connection and compassion. Most importantly, they demonstrate that survival, in its deepest sense, is not about preserving individual life, but about maintaining the bonds that make life worth living. Whether facing the immediate crisis of collapsing buildings or the long-term oppression of social control, people throughout history have discovered that love is not a luxury they can afford to set aside, but the very foundation that makes survival possible. The phone calls from September 11th and the poetry of medieval lovers both testify to this same eternal truth, that in our darkest moments, when all systems fail and all certainties collapse, the connections we have forged with others become our greatest source of strength and our most lasting legacy. And this brings us to perhaps the most unsettling truth about both September 11th and medieval survival: the arbitrary nature of who lives and who dies. In the towers, people who should have survived according to every logical calculation perished, while others, who by all accounts should have died, walked away. A janitor who knew the building's secrets guided dozens to safety. A man who stopped to help a stranger missed being in the exact spot where debris would fall. A woman who broke protocol and ignored evacuation orders found an exit that saved her life. Similarly, in medieval times, survival often hinged on the most random circumstances. A serf who happened to catch the Lord's attention might rise to become a trusted steward, while a noble's son could die from a simple infection. A woman who defied convention to learn healing arts might become indispensable to her community, while those who followed every rule perished during the next plague outbreak. The systems that promised order and predictability consistently failed when they were needed most. This randomness reveals something profound about human nature and our relationship with control. We build elaborate systems, protocols, and hierarchies because they give us the illusion of safety and predictability. We convince ourselves that if we follow the rules, stay in our designated places, and trust the institutions, we'll be protected. But history repeatedly demonstrates that in moments of true crisis, these systems become obstacles rather than solutions. The people who survived both tragedies shared certain characteristics that transcended their circumstances. They possessed an almost instinctual ability to read situations independently of what they were being told. They maintained their capacity for rapid decision-making, even under extreme stress. Most importantly, they never lost their connection to other human beings, understanding that individual survival was often impossible without collective action. Consider the volunteers who emerged immediately after the towers fell. These weren't trained emergency responders following predetermined protocols. They were ordinary people who saw suffering and responded with immediate, improvised compassion. They formed human chains to move debris, opened their homes to strangers, and created informal networks of support that proved more effective than many official relief efforts. This mirrors how medieval communities survived disasters through informal networks of mutual aid that operated outside the official feudal structure. The lesson here isn't that systems and institutions are inherently evil or useless. Rather, it's that our survival depends on maintaining our human agency and connection, even within these systems. The most dangerous thing we can do is to surrender our capacity for independent thought and action to any institution, no matter how well-intentioned or competent it appears to be. This connects to a deeper truth about love and human connection in times of crisis. The people who survived both September 11th and medieval hardships understood that love isn't a luxury that can be set aside during emergencies. It's actually the fundamental force that makes survival possible. The firefighters who ran into burning buildings weren't following protocol, they were acting from love for their fellow human beings. The medieval couples who defied social conventions to marry for love weren't being frivolous. They were creating the strong emotional bonds that would help them survive famines, plagues, and wars. Love, in this context, means more than romantic attachment. It encompasses the full spectrum of human connection: compassion for strangers, loyalty to friends, responsibility for community, and the deep recognition that our individual fates are interconnected. This understanding becomes a form of practical wisdom that helps people navigate chaos more effectively than any manual or training program. The modern world, like medieval society, often treats this kind of love as secondary to more serious concerns, like efficiency, productivity, and following proper procedures. But the historical evidence suggests this prioritization is backwards. The people who survive catastrophes are those who maintain their capacity for love and use it as a guide for action, even when official channels are telling them to do something else. This brings us to the question of what we can learn from these parallel tragedies. First, we must acknowledge that our current systems, however sophisticated they appear, are just as vulnerable to catastrophic failure as any medieval institution. The complexity of modern life creates new forms of fragility that we're only beginning to understand. Our interconnected financial systems, digital infrastructure, and supply chains all contain potential failure points that could create cascading disasters. Second, we need to cultivate the same qualities that helped people survive both September 11th and medieval crises. This means developing our capacity for independent assessment of situations, maintaining strong personal relationships that can function as support networks, and never completely surrendering our individual agency to any institution or system. It means practicing the kind of improvisation and adaptability that allows people to respond effectively to circumstances that no one anticipated. Third, we must recognize that love and human connection aren't optional extras in a survival strategy. They're the foundation that makes everything else possible. The people who survived both tragedies did so because they maintained their capacity to care for others and to inspire others to care for them. This created the trust and cooperation necessary for collective survival. Perhaps most importantly, we need to understand that survival in the modern world, like survival in medieval times, isn't primarily about individual preparation or following the right protocols. It's about maintaining the human qualities that allow communities to respond creatively and compassionately to unprecedented challenges. This requires a kind of courage that goes beyond physical bravery. It's the courage to remain fully human even when systems are failing and chaos seems to reign. The stories of September 11th and medieval survival ultimately remind us that human beings are far more resilient and capable than our institutions often assume. We have survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and countless other catastrophes, not because we had perfect systems, but because we maintained our capacity for love, creativity, and mutual support. These qualities remain our greatest assets in facing whatever challenges lie ahead. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can find some comfort in this knowledge. The same human capacity that allowed people to survive the collapse of the Twin Towers and the chaos of medieval life exists within you. It's not something that can be learned from a manual or acquired through training. It's part of your fundamental nature as a human being, the ability to love, to adapt, to help others, and to find meaning even in the midst of unimaginable difficulty. And so we return to that crystalline September morning, where the impossible became reality and ordinary people faced extraordinary choices. The towers fell not just because of structural failure, but because every system we trusted proved inadequate when confronted with the unthinkable. The emergency protocols, the communication networks, the evacuation procedures, all of it crumbled like the concrete and steel that rained down on Manhattan streets. But here's what didn't crumble. The firefighter who climbed knowing he wouldn't come down. The office worker who stayed behind to help a colleague in a wheelchair. The stranger who shared water in a stairwell. The voice on the phone saying, "I love you one last time." These weren't products of training or protocol. They were expressions of something far more ancient and enduring. You see, whether we're talking about a tower collapsing in 2001 or a heartbreaking in 1201, the fundamental equation remains unchanged. Systems fail. Protocols become obsolete. Power structures crumble. But love, connection, and human dignity, these persist across centuries of chaos. The medieval lovers we explored earlier, trapped between duty and desire, faced their own kind of structural collapse. Their world was just as rigid, just as unforgiving to those who dared to love outside prescribed boundaries. Yet their letters survive, their poetry endures, their willingness to risk everything for connection echoes through time. They understood what those trapped in the towers understood. That meaning isn't found in the systems that contain us, but in the moments when we choose each other despite those systems. This is why survival isn't really about having the right information or following the correct procedures. It's about maintaining your humanity when everything around you suggests that humanity is a luxury you can't afford. The people who survived 9/11 didn't do so because they were stronger or smarter or more prepared. They survived because they made choices, small choices. Help this person, take this route, trust this stranger, keep moving, keep loving. And those who didn't survive? They weren't failures. They were casualties of a world that had forgotten how to prepare for the unprecedented. They were victims of systems that prioritized efficiency over resilience, protocols over adaptability, control over compassion. Their deaths weren't inevitable. They were preventable. But prevention would have required acknowledging that our neat, organized world is far more fragile than we pretend. The real tragedy of 9/11 isn't just the loss of life. It's the loss of illusion, the comfortable belief that someone else has everything under control, that the systems will protect us, that the protocols will save us, that if we just follow the rules and trust the authorities, we'll be safe. September 11th shattered that illusion as completely as jet fuel shattered steel. What remains is both terrifying and liberating. We are alone with our choices. We are responsible for our own survival. We are dependent on each other in ways that no system can guarantee or replace. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And within that realism lies a profound kind of hope. Because if we're truly alone with our choices, then we're also free to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, compassion over self-preservation. These aren't just nice ideas, they're survival strategies. They're what carried people down those endless staircases. They're what sustained lovers through centuries of oppression. They're what will carry us through whatever unprecedented crisis comes next. The towers fell, the systems failed, the protocols proved useless. But somewhere in the rubble, in the stories we tell, in the memories we preserve, something else emerged. A reminder that we are capable of extraordinary grace under impossible pressure. That love really can transcend chaos. That human connection really is stronger than steel and concrete and fear. So when you ask why you wouldn't survive 9/11, perhaps you're asking the wrong question. Perhaps the question isn't whether you would survive, but whether you would choose to remain human while trying. Because in the end, that's the only choice that matters. The only choice that echoes through time. The only choice that makes survival worth surviving for.